We're just getting our last few people in to sit down for our next session. Dr. James Broadbent, who most of you probably know, is a historian who has had an extensive and esteemed career as a scholarly curator. He's an inspiring teacher, author and garden historian. Focusing on New South Wales colonial gardens, interiors, furnishings and architecture, James has brought a unique vision to the interpretation of early colonial settlement, its styles and customs. This year he was awarded a Member of the Order of Australia in recognition of his significant service and work with the National Trust of Australia and Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales. His long career has included positions with several major cultural organisations and includes his role as Senior Curatorial Advisor to the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales from 1991 to 2003. He's advised on the conservation and restoration of many significant Australian houses and gardens, including Elizabeth Farm, Vaucluse House, Roos Hill House and Farm, Government House and the recent recreation of the garden at Glenfield, Casula in southwestern Sydney. A definite nonconformist, James's study of Australia's early built heritage and social life extends beyond the pages of our national history books. He lives his vocation in the beautifully preserved small Georgian bungalow known as The Cottage, built circa 1810, on the land granted to Edward Cox in 1809 that forms the tiny village of Mulgoa at the foot of the Blue Mountains. He's curated many significant exhibitions and is the author of 7 books and more than 30 papers and journal articles.
Thank you. I recently read an extraordinary article in the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales's newsletter, Insights. It was headed, "What Future for House Museums?" What I found extraordinary about it was its almost complete lack of insight, an apparent ignorance or ignoring of how and why we have house museums. It seemed to negate or ignore what the Historic Houses Trust does or did, what it was established to do and acquired an enviable reputation in doing, and what its mission statement, increasingly incorrectly, says it does: conserve and interpret historic places. Conservation is totally ignored in this article. It is not mentioned once, yet conservation is foremost in that mission statement. Instead, we are told, I quote, "A more wonderful experience by far than any house museum are fine historic houses which are lived in and loved. Unfine houses, unmanageable mansions, humble houses, huts and tenements, cottages, and bush shanties, unlived in or unlivable, apparently do not signify for a wonderful experience and do not register as part of our domestic, architectural and social heritage. That there are houses that, because of their fragility of structure or contents, cannot survive as lived-in houses is not mentioned. Or houses whose evidence of social history is so potent, whose evidence of former or other ways of living is so important to us and rare, that they cannot survive other than as museums. Shrines to the great and good, places so pregnant with the evidence of a former life or former lives that they cannot survive other than as museums. All these are passed over. It is totally ignored that there are places that our society holds as too precious for all sorts of emotional and practice and all sorts of emotional or material reasons to be subject to the rough and tumble and chance of everyday living. No, fine houses, lived in and loved with suitable possessions, we are told, are what counts. We are told, as a justification, it seems, for this anti-museum attitude, that, quote, "a nothing-can-change attitude has no context in real life." But this is surely the justification for conservation and for house museums, rather than a negation of them. There are things, places, that our society regards as so important that we must keep them, and places so vulnerable to change that they cannot survive other than being withdrawn from real life, whatever the article may mean by that, and become museums. The article continues with other non sequiturs. It acknowledges that people value authenticity, and again I quote, the hook of the rail. But contrarily, asserts that, quote, we are more likely to gain insight into the social and architectural fabric by watching on television a meticulously crafted movie. What an extraordinary denial of the Historic Houses Trust's raison d'etre and its scholarship, which the article purports to value. Even if you believe that, it is the conservation of house museums, with the scholarship and research that should accompany it, and the carefully crafted interpretation that results, that informs such films, or prostitutes itself in order for them to be filmed. That the Trust's mission, actively to interpret these places, is grudgingly acknowledged. But although its mission statement clearly says that the interpretation should be, quote, specifically through those places, we are told that the focus is now not on places and things, but on audiences and communication. Rather than interpreting for visitors all those significances and histories for which these places are conserved, the Trust now, quote again, opens doors for them to enjoy these places in their own way. Our job is not to lecture people about history, says its director. I disagree with that, and with the fatal corollary of that statement. We don't lecture in history, therefore we don't need to know it. Next to that unfashionable objective, conservation, lecturing is, I believe, the Trust's, any Trust's or museum's role. Interpretation is not the same as lecturing, nor is lecturing the same as indoctrination, but informing, teaching, is surely the reason for interpreting. I do not believe that people visit historic houses to be entertained without being informed. I believe that the public expects public money granted to historic houses to be used to inform as much as to entertain. I do not believe that all those weekly groups of school children are there not to be informed, taught, lectured, given some understanding of the place's cultural significances. Should they be just let loose to enjoy these places in their own way? Without such a belief, there is no substance to the topic I have been asked to address, the reinterpretation of house museums. Not that I like the title much. I would rather rephrase it as the continued interpretation of house museums. Those two missions of the Historic Houses Trust are the lodestones of any house museum, conservation and interpretation. Interpretation is a subtle and ever-changing thing. Conservation is likewise subtle, but its goal is to minimize change. They compose the bipartite umbrella under which all house museums shelter. Such places as Rouse Hill and Woolmers, where conservation is, or should be, paramount, or Elizabeth Bay House and Clarendon, where interpretation is foremost. Most houses, however, like Vaucluse House or Runnymede, are combinations of the two. One cannot readily segregate them into the real and the fake. The recreated, refurnished house museum is a fake, and as such has been received criticism in recent years. Unjust criticism where the concept of the recreated environment has been condemned out of hand. Just where the quality of the scholarship that underlies it is wanting. Given that it is understood that a place is a reproduction or recreation, an honest fake, and not promoted as intrinsically significant, Ruskinian notions of morality and truth are not relevant. It is the half and half places, like Vaucluse and Runnymede, that need to be careful. Places whose furnishings are part original and part recreated. I still believe nearly 40 years after my first house museum, that recreation is valid, although I think I've probably been the most Ruskinian conservationist round. Or perhaps it's because of that. I think I was the first person in Australia clearly to stress a distinction between conservation and interpretation at a time when the Ecomos and the Borough Charter still compounded and confused the two. I was certainly the first to paint things in black and white, disconcerting architects by talking of the real and the fake. But I have never doubted that faking, recreating, can be a most immediate way of interpreting history, direct, three-dimensional, experiential. Most history is interpreted and taught through the written word, but it can also be interpreted subtly or powerfully through objects, spaces, and the juxtaposition and arrangement of objects in spaces, through experiencing environments, that is, through furnished rooms. Film or video is fine, but it doesn't have, as the Historic Houses Trust's article calls it, the hook of the real, and is always striving for greater realism and 3D effects. Yet furnished houses are 3D and real, even fake ones, but all the better if they are conserved ones. Although fake ones may have the edge over conserved ones sometimes, for without the constraints of conservation, they can be more focused, as Elizabeth Farm's interpretation was, carefully scripted and directed for optimum emotion and understanding of the story. Although mute, recreated house museums are documentaries, histories, written in objects, not words. And as documentaries and histories, they must change with time and changing society. Reinterpretation is essential to the museum discipline. I have often used the analogy of the lecturer who gives the same lecture year in, year out. Perhaps it becomes boring. More importantly, it becomes irrelevant. Not the facts and figures so much as the focus and the thesis. Knowledge is refined and extended, but thinking changes. Perhaps I'm that lecturer, but surely you do not expect a written history, say a biography of Churchill, to be the same after the war, on his death, and now. History is not just the chronicling of facts. It is the relationship of the present to the past. It changes, and so must house museum interpretation change. Not because it is fashionable or unfashionable in the museum world, but because the lessons change in relevancy. It may be because of changed social attitudes to, say, domestic service, a perennial old hobby horse. Or it may be because of refined knowledge of the style, cut and hang of curtains. The spectrum of interpretation in a furnished house is extraordinary. Old Government House Parramatta was groundbreaking in the 1960s with its acquisition and presentation of colonial furniture. But by the 1980s, it was a book that needed rewriting. I have rewritten it, and I accept that it is reviewed and criticised, favourably or unfavourably, will be read or put aside, and that someone will rewrite it again in a few years' time. Change is essential. But not because, as bored or ambitious museum professionals and unimaginative marketers constantly tell us, the public wants change. At Government House they didn't. But because history, which is our currency, demands it. The public is bored, it wants change, we must change. That seems to be the mantra of each new wave of museum management. does it? Ian Stevenson said something to me the other day which resonated. He was quoting Ian Wallace from that delightful old BBC programme, My Music, that there is always someone hearing Beethoven for the first time. The public gets bored, it wants change. We don't hear much about museum management getting bored, or not coping with the status quo, or becoming too ambitious or too greedy, or being unsympathetic to its predecessors, wanting to make its own mark, wanting change. It seems to me that the push for change comes as much from within, for all sorts of reasons nothing to do with interpretation, as from without. Let us look at the rise and fall of a fictional museum trust set up with public money to present house museums. Its museums are newly established with the expertise of curators and with professional staff. Their style and quality are praised. They are the flavour of the month, are fashionable and popular. Inevitably, after their novelty fades, the number of visitors declines. This is partly arrested by holding associated displays and exhibitions, seminars and study days, and special events. But familiarity, we are told, breeds contempt. Ambition, boredom, and a seeking after greener pastures begin to work their mischief within the organisation. Staff is expanded. Its job is to increase visitor numbers. The catch cry becomes, we must make more money no matter how much it costs. Marketers are engaged. But being ignorant of and uninterested in history, they struggle to market house museums. They don't understand the product they're selling. They don't know how to market staples like Vegemite. They don't know how to market cornflakes except by promoting the plastic toys in the packet. And plain old cornflakes soon become Cocoa Pops. Special events that focused on the significance of the places are replaced by circuses. Slowly, or not so slowly, the integrity of the organisation erodes as an ambitious, costly machine insidiously evolves. Designers are brought in to design, publicists are brought in to publicise, editors to edit, subdirectors to subdirect, general managers to manage generally. Curators? Well, what use are they? They only curate, whatever that is, and are constantly obstructive to everyone else, carping, always banging on about conservation constraints. The tail now wags the dog. No one dares to say that the burgeoning machine, the infrastructure, the bureaucracy is growing out of all proportion to the product, to the demand for the product. No one dares to say that we could get more visitors and be better off if we simply paid them to come with the money we spent on publicists and marketers. No, it's the product's fault. We must change the product so that we can keep the administrative and marketing machine grinding on. Forget about conserving the house. It's the bureaucratic machine we must conserve. The running costs rise, the attendances don't. That the organisation now consumes an enormous amount of money, ostensibly granted for conservation and education, is blamed on low visitor numbers. It seems a bit like a fairy tale of a spendthrift young lord blaming the limited income from his inherited estate for his bankruptcy, rather than blaming his profligacy. But salvation is at hand, in two forms: froth and bubble and events and venues. The House Museum Trust is subsumed by the Froth and Bubble Trust and the Events and Venues Trust, with froth and bubble publicists and events and venues managers. Politicians are delighted. There's always an event to open, a headline to have. Words in museum mission statements, like conservation, interpretation, integrity, are merely words. A mission statement is only another bureaucratic box to tick. No, it's not forsaking the old reactionary values, if there's anyone left to remember what scholarship and intellectual rigour are. It's not dumbing down. It's opening the doors for every man to enjoy these places in his own way. Expertise is not needed at any level. Our fictional trust owns a small historic farm, but expertise to run it is unnecessary. The cows can be taught to break down the fences only on Thursdays, or eat poisonous Cape tulip only on Fridays when the contracted farmer is there. And what is the use of a groundsman to clear a blocked gutter in a storm when we have contracted gardeners only a phone call and 30 miles away? Fence rails shall fall, roofing iron shall loosen, shutters shall flap, only when the contracted builders are scheduled. All that binding with iron where it loosens and staying with timber where it declines is Ruskinian claptrap. The place has never had a proper restoration, so let's get regular building contractors in instead of all that watching with anxious care stuff. And a proper job in covering the holes in the ceiling with gyprock. We don't want conservators and housekeepers. They take up scarce funds needed to administer contracts. So managers supplant curators, and contractors supplant in-house expertise. Managers make decisions without taking advice, and contractors bring competitive prices instead of knowledge and experience. Conservation by contract becomes the fateful motto. And of course, with the shedding of old ways, we must rebrand ourselves. A new name. Something trendy and trite and tacky, as banal as meaningless. How about something like living history? Our marketers say that every man will lap that up for a couple of years, even if he hasn't a clue what it means and what it does. The tail has grown so big and fat and must keep wagging. And even if it has not completely consumed the dog, there is no need for the dog to bark. For as the article I began with says, we are more likely to gain insight into the social and architectural fabric by watching television. And our furnished rooms are ready-made film sets. Filming is good money, and it's worth risking the conservation of an historic interior by letting a film crew, inadequately supervised, make a film that will give every man a television soapy's view of history. If we reduce the opening times of these white elephants to a few hours of a weekend, we can reduce staff and have more time for events and venues. But enough of this fictional trust. What about the National Trust? Unlike our fictional trust, and unlike the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales, which for all its millions in funding now opens its houses to the public only for a few hours of a weekend, the National Trust of New South Wales, with no money, valiantly opens Old Government House Parramatta 6 days a week. Yes, the Historic Houses Trust does lots of other things. They just don't happen to be what it was set up for. The conservation and interpretation of historic places. But the National Trust is still, thank God, largely an amateur organisation, as Ian will explain, and largely without the blight of ambitious professionalism. Old Government House is an interesting example of reinterpretation. It has taken a long time, but the decision to reinterpret accepted. Over the last decade, it has turned itself round, not with money from grants, which has been minimal, but by the efforts of a remarkable team of volunteers, women who call themselves sewers, but have set about sewing, upholstering, restoring, carpentering, screen printing, weaving, painting, embroidering, and making just about everything that in another museum would have cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and to a degree of accuracy unobtainable through normal commercial channels. What began as making do has turned, owing to this volunteer group, into an exercise in authenticity unrivaled in the furnishings of any other house museum in Australia. Only last week they finished printing a chintz border copied from a mid-19th century fragment to edge the curtains of a contemporary colonial bed. Where else is detail like that being attempted and achieved? It can only be achieved by volunteers, and I think Ian Stevenson may expand on this. For such work is impossible to price and contract, although they did help the Historic Houses Trust out with the refurnishing of the drawing room of Government House Sydney, where the required detail of the passementerie was otherwise impossible to achieve, even with that substantial budget. They are now doing the same for Calthorpe's house in Canberra. They have vastly underestimated the time and effort involved, so that Canberra has got a very good deal, getting its work done very cheaply. But Old Government House is $20,000 or $30,000 better off. This grassroots, back-to-basics volunteer system is perhaps a way forward in the reinterpreting of house museums, and the Historic Houses Trust recently set up its own volunteer team. But these teams need expertise, leadership, and goodwill, all of which appear to be in short supply. But let us look now, to end, at not such corps de ballet, but at some prima donnas, artists in residence. To me, one of the most bizarre aspects of the faddish reinterpretation of houses has been the fashion for artists in residence. It all started, perhaps, when during the Second War artists were commissioned to record historic houses in England, and as a result we have such wonderful evocations, for example, of Windsor Castle or Renishaw by John Piper. But now we're talking of something very different. Forget curators, conservators, historians, but engage artists. Far more sexy, our publicists tell us. Guidebooks and histories are boring. It's for art installations now we're enthusing. Let artists be employed to interpret places for every man. It is supposed to be popular, and probably is amongst the artists' cronies and an arty milieu. But how on earth can we take seriously, can every man take seriously, the laying of fluorescent light tubes in a zigzag pattern on the floor of Miss Macleigh's bedroom, or glass bubbles popping out of a chimney-piece, or I might add after Louis' talk, cups popping out of a chimney-piece, like a trite ABC Philip, as historical interpretation? It may or may not be art. But what is it to do with the primary objectives of the House Museum, conservation and interpretation? The primary objective of the artist is to make a work of art, not to interpret history. Why should historic houses, museums, substitute artists? Do art galleries substitute historic houses? The issue I have with the artist in residence is that it is assumed that the artist has some innate, God-given insight into and skill in interpretation. No need for research and the discipline of historical analysis. A fine novelist is not ipso facto a good historian. A fine artist is not ipso facto a good historical interpreter. Time and time again, I have seen interpretative art installations imposed on sites. They are either so obscure that it doesn't matter what site they're imposed on. Fluorescent tubes would still look like fluorescent tubes in Bishop Nixon's bedroom at Runnymede. Or When they are intelligible to every man, and even to me, they are banal renderings of predictable themes: convicts, women, aborigines, servants, or romanticised pulp history. Occasionally, I have enjoyed them as works of art, but rarely have I seen any that help me in understanding the place. Overwhelmingly, they have the capacity, if thank God only temporarily, to divert or destroy pleasure in and understanding of the place. Just more sophisticated plastic toys in the packet of cornflakes. They may or may not be art, but to me they are anti-history and anti-interpretation, and sometimes, by their physical intrusion, anti-conservation. And as I am not an historically ignorant marketer or publicist, I cannot tell whether they are as sexy as a plastic toy in a cornflakes packet or not. I've said a lot about how not to reinterpret house museums, rather than how to reinterpret. It's easy to be negative, it's true. But for me, interpretation is something that is continuous, not something to be picked up and set aside and picked up again when it needs dusting or is broken. In this, my analogy to a written biography falters. One can, in a house museum, write an entirely new biography, but it is usually impractical, for refurnishing a house museum is a far more costly exercise than writing a book. But in a house museum, one has the opportunity of continued refinement, revision, and editing that the lecturer may have, but the published historian doesn't. That is what the curator does, or should do: refine, revise, edit continuously. Continued research for more historical evidence, continued reference to that evidence, visiting and revisiting inventories and plans, descriptions, colour scrapes. The skill is not in the method, it is in the implementation, in responsibly balancing demands of budget and time, expectations and personnel, paid and particularly volunteer. All this can be done swiftly and successfully, as Gemma Webberley, both manager and curator, has recently shown at Runnymede in Hobart. Money was available for painting, but the wholesale rejigging of the place, that's a very technical term for interpretation, has been achieved through commitment, expertise, open-mindedness, and hard work. In whatever order you wish, none is dispensable. A fresh wind has blown through the house. Colours have changed, finishes have changed. The drawing room is now the dining room is now the study, the music room is now the drawing room, and the house is now Bishop Nixon's again. Refinements can and should continue to be made, but it doesn't necessarily take grants and thousands of dollars and managers and designers and consultants and publishers and marketers. Every little act is an act of reinterpretation, a new interpretation, good or bad. The right flowers, arranged in the right way, in the right vase, in the right position, in the right room, at the right time of the year. Or sexy rexy roses in a Tupperware bowl. Years ago, I would ask applicants for curators' jobs how they would arrange the flowers. It was not a flippant question, although often a disconcerting one, and struck at the heart of what I believe a good recreated house museum should be. I'm sure I would not be allowed now, under human resources dictates, to ask such a question. Jean de Pré in a Coalport vase in Elizabeth Bay's drawing room. Plastic fruit in a cracked comport in the dining room at Rouse Hill. These are the essence of the house museum, recreated and conserved. God, not the devil, is in the detail. The devil doesn't give a damn. He's into management and venue hire. In case you've been wondering what the significance of this vulgar image is, and who is Rosemary Valadon, You may well ask. I haven't a clue. It's the publicity for a recent exhibition from an artist in residence at the Historic Houses Trust.
Thank you very much, Dr. Broadbent, for the battle cry for the integrity of the House Museum.